ASA Plansky from Golden Stands RC&D. ASA is the Terrestrial Invasive Species Coordinator at Golden Sands Resource Conservation and Development Council. That's what the RC&D stands for. Conservation nonprofit based out of Stevens Point. Within Golden Sands RC&D, ASA is a coordinator of the Central Wisconsin Invasive Species Partnership, a cooperative invasive species group serving 7 counties in central Wisconsin. Most of her work focuses on planning collaborative education, prevention, mapping, and control projects for invasive plants like garlic mustard and buckthorn. ASA also assists with forestry projects through Golden Sands RC&D, including cooperating with Woods and Wildlife and an initiative focused on developing local forest landowners cooperations and helping neighbors work together to manage their woodlands. The mic is yours, Asa.
So my name's Asa. I work for Golden Sands and I focus on invasive species. And today I'm going to talk to you guys about invasive species and effects on maple trees. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is just the definition of an invasive species. We're going to start at the basics here. So there are 2 things that make something invasive, and this is based on a definition from, I think it's in federal law. The U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service both use this definition. So the 2 things that are important when you're considering if something is invasive. Number 1, an invasive species is not native to the ecosystem. So it hasn't been there for very long. It didn't evolve with the plants and animals that are naturally there. And this tends to come with some problems. Usually it's not very palatable to like wildlife and bugs that are in an area. And a lot of times invasive species come over from whatever area they're normally from, and they don't bring the diseases that normally would kind of keep them in check. So that's kind of an issue. They're able to grow a little more than you want them to. The other thing that makes something invasive is that it can cause harm, or it does cause harm. And this harm can be to the economy, the environment, or human health, or some other kind of harm. So this kind of, you can think about agricultural weeds can have issues with the agriculture and the economy, harming the environment. And then some plants like wild parsnip is one of the biggest ones that people think about with human health harm. Because wild parsnip, if you get sap on your skin and you're in the sunlight, you get some pretty nasty burns. So plants can cause problems in a bunch of different ways, but that's one of the aspects of being invasive. Now I have kind of an illustration of that definition. These 2 plants, the first one is hydrangeas, which most of you probably recognize. Hydrangeas are not considered an invasive species because they don't fit that first trait, or no, the second trait. So they are not from, Wisconsin. I'm not exactly sure what area they're from, but they're not native to Wisconsin. So that's almost invasive, but they don't cause any harm. So they're not considered an invasive species because they don't cause any problems. They behave, they stay in your yard, and they just look pretty, but they don't really cause any issues. The other plant here is one that is sometimes the source of some contention. Poison ivy. It definitely causes harm, and I can attest to that because I'm allergic to it, and I usually get poison ivy once a year. So it's not a good plant. However, it's actually native to Wisconsin. So poison ivy, I never use the word invasive for because it doesn't technically fit the definition. However, I would definitely control poison ivy if I had it on my property. And I like to use the terms nuisance species or aggressive species for things like poison ivy that are native, but that are still kind of a pain in the butt. So that's kind of sums up what an invasive species is. And here are some traits, some common traits of invasive plants. Not all invasive plants have all of these traits, but they are pretty common. The first one is rapid growth and spread. So this kind of correlates to the image that I have on the right side of the screen. That's Oriental Bittersweet. It's an invasive vine. And it's, as you can see, it's growing like crazy, and it's actually grown over trees and kind of smothered them. So rapid growth, and it spreads very, very quickly. The second trait is producing a lot of seed. That's pretty common so that the plant can grow more quickly and spread. Many invasive plants survive well in disturbed areas like abandoned farm fields, or maybe an area of your yard that got dug up for some reason. The seeds tend to spread easily, and the seeds could be spread by people, like things like burrs, spread by animals, birds that eat them and then poop them out somewhere else, or spread by the wind. But a lot of invasive plants, their seeds spread pretty easily. And a lot of invasive plants are tolerant of a wide range of conditions. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the disturbed areas thing. They're pretty much happy anywhere, a lot of these species, and some of them can handle wet soil or dry soil and full sun or full shade. So they do pretty well, which is a problem. So now I'm going to go into some specific research on how invasive species impact maples. And the first area that I'm going to focus in on is woody invasive species. So trees, shrubs, woody vines. And the first slide that I have here is how woody invasive species impact maple seedlings. And I have two main papers that showed some connections in this area. The first one showed that areas with large Amur honeysuckle plants, and large, like diameter-wise, like really big plants. Areas with these large plants had fewer sugar maple seedlings. So we don't have Amur honeysuckle very much in Wisconsin. It's not very plentiful here, but we do have a lot of other species of invasive honeysuckle that this relationship would probably still be seen with, because they're very similar plants. Also, this other piece of research showed that after controlling woody invasive species like Japanese barberry, Oriental bittersweet, and burning bush, there were more native tree seedlings, including maples. So this kind of shows, this research shows that woody invasive plants tend to have kind of a bad effect on these maple seedlings. And this is kind of expected, that the seedlings would be, you know, the most vulnerable stage, because seedlings don't really have a big root system set up. They don't have a lot of leaves yet. So they're kind of more susceptible to things in the environment that will kind of mess up their growth. But it's not just maple seedlings that we have to worry about. There's also some research that is coming out that shows some issues with saplings. So this paper here showed that areas invaded by glossy buckthorn had reduced growth and survival of sugar and red maple saplings. The photo on the side there is glossy buckthorn. So this is a little more concerning, because you kind of expect seedlings to be fragile, but if we're also seeing kind of this bad relationship of woody invasive plants kind of messing with our saplings, then that's not good. It sounds like they might be having more of an effect than we like. So why does this happen? Most of the theories about why these woody invasives make it harder for maple trees to grow, seedlings and saplings to grow, they kind of focus on the availability of resources. So light availability, that can be an issue if a invasive plant is growing over maple seedlings and they aren't getting any sun at all, then they can't really make any energy. And that can be an issue. They aren't going to grow as well. Also, water and nutrient availability. It's possible that these invasive plants might be able to like suck up water and nutrients more quickly or more efficiently than our maples do. And then the maples aren't able to get the resources that they need. But there might be other reasons. And some of these reasons can get kind of weird and indirect. So we're going to talk about some of that next. So we're going to talk about garlic mustard in maples. Garlic mustard is an invasive plant that a lot of people know about. I wouldn't say it's as widespread as like buckthorn in Wisconsin. It's more common in, I would say, like residential areas and like cities. But it is an invader of forests. It grows really well in forested understories, and there's pictures of it on this slide. Some research showed that areas with lots of garlic mustard had fewer sugar and red maple seedlings. So this is really similar to that woody invasives argument, but these aren't woody. These are just like flowers. They die back every year. But it's interesting because people were wondering why this happened, and they went into some more research and they did more experiments to figure out what's going on behind the scenes. And they kind of figured out some stuff, but to explain the stuff that's going on that makes garlic mustard such a nasty plant for maple trees, I'm going to have to explain a couple things. So the first thing is our Muscular mycorrhizal fungi, which some of you might know about already. I'm going to call it AMF from now on because it's less of a mouthful. So this is fungi, so it is like mushrooms. And these fungi are symbiotic with many plant species, way more plants than we thought originally. Once we discovered this, we're discovering that more and more plants are symbiotic with this fungi. And symbiotic just means that they live in close association. But these AMF actually attach inside your plant roots. So they penetrate into the roots of trees and other plants, and they make little arbuscules inside the roots, and they kind of live in there, but they also have fungal tissue that extends out into the soil. And AMF provide nutrients and water for the plant. They might also provide disease resistance. This is definitely an area of study that is growing every year, so they're kind of still investigating that part. But they provide water and nutrients, and the plant sends down sugars that it makes in its leaves and gives it to the fungi in exchange. So it's usually a beneficial thing, and both the fungi and the tree get things that they need from the relationship. So many woody seedlings are thought to be dependent on AMF when they're seedlings, especially because the seedlings have such small root systems that they can't gather that much water and nutrients. But if they are connected to their little mushroom friends in the soil, then they can get a better base to collect like nitrogen and phosphorus and water and stuff. So it is thought that woody seedlings especially are pretty dependent on their relationship with AMF. So some research went into this, and they found that sugar and red maples that were grown in soils invaded by garlic mustard had less AMF colonization and slower growth. So there wasn't even a garlic mustard like growing with them. They just took soils that had garlic mustard in it before, and they grew these plants in it. So it seems like garlic mustard is releasing something or changing the soil in some way that makes it harder for this fungi to grow. And as a consequence, makes it harder for the trees to grow. In addition, there was another separate study that showed that sugar maple seedlings grown in areas invaded by garlic mustard. Again, it showed reduced colonization of the AMF, and the AMF that were there were different species than uninvaded areas. So I made a graphic of kind of the big picture of what's going on here. So if we start in the upper left, garlic mustard invades an area, and then it does something to the soil, and the beneficial fungi struggle. You can see because the mushroom is sad. And then because the fungi are struggling, maple seedlings that are associating with the fungi don't receive as much water or nutrients from their fungal partners. And then as a consequence, the maple seedlings struggle too. And then unfortunately, this is kind of a positive feedback loop, because if an area that normally would be covered in seedlings, it doesn't have any seedlings anymore, or has a lot fewer seedlings, then that's probably more room for garlic mustard to invade. So then it probably just contributes to the cycle. So kind of bad news here. And kind of the big idea is that invasive species can affect these native plants in weird and kind of indirect ways. And over time, researchers will continue to discover new interactions, and most of them are probably going to be harmful. But if that wasn't enough for you, I have some other problems that invasive species cause. There's problems with wildlife and biodiversity. So invasive plants outcompete your native plants. And so you aren't going to have as many different species as you used to have. It's going to be more of a monoculture. And wildlife usually don't like to eat invasive species. So the habitat isn't as good for them when it's all invasive plants. Additionally, some invasive plants can increase erosion. This is especially common if they grow in like dense thickets and nothing can grow underneath them, because then when it rains and water's running over the ground, it's just going to pick up the soil underneath that thicket because there's no plants, short plants towards the ground holding it in place. Another issue is property and trail access. This is especially connected to this photo on the right side. This is a Japanese barberry infested area. And this plant is super spiny. So if you're trying to get through that property, and if you're trying to like tap your trees that are in the middle of that, it's gonna be no fun. Even in the winter, the spines are all there. So that's not conducive to traveling across your property. Aesthetics can be an issue too. I don't really like to look at just like a wall of buckthorn. I like the look of a forest that's kind of got more of an open understory, and I think a lot of people agree with me there. So if you just have all this brush, it's not very pretty. And finally, you can have some problems with altered soil chemistry. So that garlic mustard example that I shared before, garlic mustard is obviously changing the soil in some way that's impacting the plants. But there are probably other things that happen with invasive species where they're altering the soil and changing the community in ways that either we don't understand or that I don't have time to go into today. So there's a bunch of ways that invasive species are changing your property if they're present there. Okay, so the last part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about some common invasive plants and how to identify them. I'm going to go through pretty quick because I think I have kind of a lot of them, not a ton, less than 10. And then I'm going to talk about ways to control invasive plants. So our first species is garlic mustard, which you saw in some slides before. Kind of the takeaways on identification of garlic mustard is that it has white flowers. It blooms in early spring. The flowers have 4 petals. And if you crush a leaf, it smells like garlic. So it's kind of an easy one to identify that way. In the mid to late summer on, the plants kind of die back. They're not going to be as obvious. This photo in the middle is their seed heads. So that's what you're going to see. And then in the upper right, those are like the first year plants. So they're just leaves sticking up out of the ground. And you'll also be able to see those later in the summer, but they're not very obvious. So it's easiest to get an eye on in like May when they're blooming. Our second invasive plant here is buckthorn. This is probably the most common like plant, not necessarily the most common invasive plant, but the one that people know the most about, and have heard the name before. So garlic mustard is a shrub or small tree. It has these kind of egg-shaped leaves with pointed tips, and it's got these black berries. And if you look at its branching structure, I'm sure everybody is very aware of opposite branching, because if you're trying to find your maple trees, they're one of the fewer trees with opposite branching patterns. Buckthorn has almost opposite branching if you look at the leaves on the stem, but it's called sub-opposite because it's not perfect opposite branching. And sometimes it almost looks alternate. There are 2 kinds of buckthorn. Common buckthorn has toothed leaves, and it also has thorns at the end of its twigs. And glossy buckthorn has smooth leaves, smooth edged leaves. Glossy buckthorn also has these reddish roots. If you pull it out of the ground, you can see that. Honeysuckle is our next species here. This is another pretty common one. There are multiple species of honeysuckle that are invasive and they hybridize, so I'm not going to worry about specific species. But this does make them a little bit more variable. Their leaves can be ovals or they can be more of a football shaped kind of deal. And they have these pretty flowers that can be pink or white. You can see that in the upper left. They get berries that are red or orange, and they look juicy. They are not edible, unfortunately. And then honeysuckle, if you break a twig, they're hollow on the inside of their twigs. We do have some native honeysuckles in Wisconsin, especially northern Wisconsin. I see bush honeysuckle pretty common up there. But bush honeysuckle, the native variety, if you break a twig, it should not be hollow on the inside. It'll have like a pith in there. It won't be hollow. But if you're concerned about any of this, there's a lot of information online. I'll get to a resources slide at the end, or you can reach out to your local extension staff, county staff, or someone like me who works for a cooperative invasive species group. Anyway, the next species here is Oriental Bittersweet. This is not super common across Wisconsin, I would say, but it's also kind of hard to ID, so I think it's underreported. Oriental Bittersweet is a vine, and it's a woody vine. That photo in the upper right is like a woody, the vine towards the ground of a really, really old specimen. So they get super thick if they're really old and woody. It's like a tree almost. And these can girdle your trees depending on the way that they're growing. So they can kill your trees, which is not great. The leaves on Oriental Bittersweet are super variable. They can be round, they can be pointed, they can be little, they can be big. So I don't really base my identification on that. It's much more important to look for the fruits. And in late summer and fall, you will see them like that photo in the lower left. There will be these like yellowish balls all over the stem. And then as you get to the winter time, on the upper left, they split open, and then they have a capsule. The split open part sits on top of the berry. And the split open part's going to be kind of this orange color. The berry's going to be bright red. We have a native bittersweet. And the way to tell the native bittersweet, which is American bittersweet from Oriental, is that native bittersweet, all the fruits and flowers are going to be just at the end of the stalk, at the end of the vine. Oriental bittersweet, as you can see here, it's scattered all along the vine. Anywhere the leaf comes off, it'll have fruits and berries. Our next species is autumn olive. This is another pretty common one. It's a shrub or small tree, and it's pretty easy to identify because of its silvery leaves, especially the undersides of the leaves are really silvery. And the twigs are this coppery color. The berries have silver specks too, and it can have thorns. Some specimens have thorns. The next plant is Japanese barberry. This is a shrub, but it's kind of a smaller shrub. It's always multiple stems, and they tend to like arch over. It doesn't shoot up straight like a tree does. And I've never seen a Japanese barberry taller than maybe 5 feet. They tend to be pretty short. Japanese barberry is super spiny. That's a good way to recognize it. It also gets these red oval-y berries, and it holds onto the berries in the wintertime. So this is another one that you can identify in the winter if you see those berries hanging underneath the branches. I see Japanese barberry planted in people's yards a lot. That's how a lot of these invasive species were introduced, is people planted them because they thought they were pretty. So I personally wouldn't plant Japanese barberry in a landscape setting. However, they do have varieties that are sterile. They've done like special plant genetic stuff where the plants can't reproduce. So they are safe to, some of them are safe to plant in your yard without having to worry about them invading your woodland. And then our last plant is another kind of common landscape plant. It's winged burning bush. And a lot of people plant this one because it has really stunning red color in the fall. That's why it's called burning bush. And a good way to identify this plant is it has opposite leaves. And if you look at the twigs, they're winged. So they have these like corky wings sticking out of them. And there can be 4 or 2. You can kind of see it on the photo on the far right, but it's not super visible. But yeah, it's a rough twig because it has these wings sticking out the side. And then the berries on this plant are kind of similar to that Oriental Bittersweet, where they split open and they have the split open part sitting on top. It's a darker color over this red berry. So those are all my invasive plants. Now I will tell you some stuff about how to control them. So the first tactic that I have to control invasive plants is pulling them out. This works well for garlic mustard and for smaller woody invasives. And you can just pull them out with your hands with gloves on. Garlic mustard, hand pulling is a great way to control it. Another way, if you got larger plants, is to get one of these pulling tools. And this photo on the slide shows a weed wrench, which is an example of this. It uses leverage to pull the stuff out of the ground that might be too big for you to pull up by hand. The weed wrench isn't sold anymore, but they sell some other tools really similar. If you just Google weed wrench, all the other similar tools will come up and you'll be able to see where to purchase those. This does make some soil disturbance. So that's a thing to consider, especially if you're on a slope. You don't really want to pull a big plant out of the ground and have a bunch of dirt kind of dug up that might erode down to the bottom of the slope, especially if there's like a stream at the bottom. You don't want to get a bunch of sediment in the stream. But this is a good way to avoid chemical use. Another thing to control invasive plants would be cutting or mowing them. This is usually not effective alone or if you just do it once. If you just cut a buckthorn plant with a saw, it's going to resprout like crazy, and it's probably going to be more work to control it after that because you're going to have 10 stems where you just had one before. But some plants, if you mow it every year, something like garlic mustard, you can definitely knock that back and potentially get it under control if you mow it frequently. And a lot of times with cutting woody invasives, you incorporate herbicide into that and you paint it onto the cut stem. You can smother invasive plants. If you have something like garlic mustard, you can put black plastic over it or mulch or a combination or cardboard, stuff like that. And I don't think it's not going to eliminate the plants, but it will knock them back and make it easier. You'll probably have less plants to deal with. With garlic mustard and a lot of invasive plants, the seeds survive in the soil for a long time. Garlic mustard, I think it's like at least 7 years. So any of these tactics, any invasive plant control, it's kind of a long-term thing. But if you catch it early before you have a huge infestation, it's going to be easier. You can also, after cutting a woody plant, you can cover the stump. They have these things called buckthorn baggies, which there's a picture of on the slide. You can also use a tin can. And the thought here is that the stump is getting blocked from the sun and so it won't resprout. So that's another option for chemical-free control. And then finally, there's herbicide use. And I think if you are controlling invasive plants next to your maple trees that you're tapping, I don't think you get to have an organic. I think that kind of makes your product not organic, but I'm not sure. I'm not an organic. That's not my job, is to certify organic people, but you definitely look into that before. If you're an organic producer, check out what the rules are. But some of the different ways to apply herbicide would be foliar, which is spraying the leaves, or cut stump, where you cut the tree down and you put herbicide on its stump. Be sure that you always read the whole label and follow all the precautions. An herbicide label is a legally binding document. So make sure that you're completely aware of how you're supposed to do it, where you're supposed to apply it, etc. And it's important to note that certain species respond better to certain herbicides. So make sure to do your research because you want to make sure that whatever herbicide you're using is going to work against the plant that you're trying to kill, and that it'll work the best that you can with applying as little chemical as possible. For more information about controlling invasive plants, I recommend these resources. UW Extension fact sheets. You can just Google UW Extension invasives fact sheets, and they have really good identification and control info. You can also look at woody invasives of the Great Lakes, woodyinvasives.org. They have identification, control info, regulations, and they have native alternatives to plant, which is good if you're looking at what to plant in your yard. And then finally, the website for the Central Wisconsin Invasives Partnership. We have identification and control info, and I coordinate this group, and our website is cwipartnership.org. And then I wanted to plug a different program that we have with Golden Sands RC&D. It's called Cooperating for Woods and Wildlife. We work to join nearby landowners together and we formed Deer Management Assistance Program Cooperatives, or it's called DMAP. But through this program, you get site visits from a wildlife biologist and forester. And so this can be good. The forester can help give you recommendations that are tailored to maple production or syrup production. You can also potentially get reduced price antlerless tags if you're a hunter and your property has a lot of browse pressure. It's also just nice if you're interested in this program. It's a good avenue to work with your neighbors on different projects like wildlife habitat, timber. If you have a timber project, if you have a logging coming up, maybe your neighbor wants to get in on that and you can hire a logger together. Or invasive species control. Invasive species don't pay attention to property boundaries, and so if this plant is over at your neighbor's yard, it's going to keep spreading over to your yard unless you kind of treat all of it together on a larger scale. It can be more successful that way. Through this program, Cooperating for Woods and Wildlife, we're creating landowner cooperatives in 12 Golden Sands counties. So all the counties on this map except for Columbia, because Columbia just joined Golden Sands in 2021, so they weren't involved when we wrote the grant application. But if you're in Taylor, Marathon, Wood, Portage, Wapaka, Outagamie, Monroe, Juneau, Adams, Waushara, Marquette, or Green Lake counties, and you're maybe interested in this program to kind of work with your neighbors on land management, and you get these cool little pluses of working with a wildlife biologist, forester, all this stuff, just let me know. My contact information will be on the last slide, so I can connect you with the right people if you're interested in this. So this is my list of sources. This was kind of all the information about specific invasive plants and how they impacted maple trees. If you want any of this information, let me know and I can send you the titles of the papers and stuff. They were all available for free. Okay, so that is my presentation. My contact information is all on here. And then I think if anybody has any questions, somebody can read them to me and I can answer.
Thank you, ASA. Appreciate that. We do have a couple of questions that came up here. One of them was actually already answered, but I thought maybe you want to answer it for the crowd. What are the large vines that wrap around tree trunks and kill them?
Yeah, so it could be a lot of things. Oriental Bittersweet is one invasive plant that does that, but there are nuisance native plants that'll do the same thing. Grapevine is one that comes to mind. You should look at the leaves during the growing season and you can usually identify it from that. But grapevine is kind of shreddy bark. It's kind of reddish colored. Depending on where you are in the state, it might be other things too. But it could be native or invasive. So you're going to have to do some digging to figure out what it is.
Someone answered and suggested it could be a Virginia creeper too, but that's just another option. So the other question we have here is, how long does the smothering take to kill it off? So when they were talking about you were smothering things there, they have an acre of buckthorn. So how long do you have to have the cover to get it to die?
So with buckthorn, if it's probably going to be larger plants already. So you're going to be cutting the stems and like covering the stump. If you're using like a tin can or a buckthorn baggie to cover a stump after you cut it, I suggest leaving it in place for like 3 years because these plants have a lot of energy reserves in their roots. And it's best to just keep them out of the sun for as long as possible because if they do resprout, they're gonna try their hardest to survive. If it's smaller plants, I wouldn't really recommend just mulching over buckthorn or putting plastic over buckthorn. It's probably going to be easier to hand pull the plants if they're small enough because with a woody plant, trying to get enough mulch or plastic over it's going to be kind of a pain in the butt.
All right, thank you. We had one other question from the room here. They're fighting water hemp in their fields and wondering if you've had any luck fighting that and if you've seen it move into the forests at all.
Yeah, so I don't know that much about water hemp. I think it's like an agricultural pest. You're saying it's in fields. I don't really work as much with agricultural stuff, so I haven't heard of it being in forests or kind of prairie stuff like that. I would check out UW Extension. They probably have more information about that, especially the Wren's Weed Lab, RENZ. It's kind of connected to those invasive species fact sheets. But if you look up Wren's Weed Science or something, he has a lot more information about agricultural pests, and they do a lot more research on that kind of thing.
All right. I don't believe we have any other questions. So I appreciate the time, ASA, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
We are getting close